In the autumn of 1908, a 5-man crew was pulling down the final remaining cabin on the former Ravenel Bluff Plantation in South Carolina's Low Country. They swung their crowbars into a wall that had been nailed shut, tarred over, and whitewashed 3 separate times over 45 years. The man who had ordered it sealed in March of 1863 had been dead for a long time. His widow had passed the previous winter. The property's deed had changed hands 4 times, with each new owner told by the Ravenel family's former overseer that the little cabin at the rice field's edge could be demolished, but never, for any reason, opened. When the first board came loose that October afternoon, the foreman stepped back from the smell that poured out into the pine, heavy air. 2 of the younger workers made the sign of the cross, the oldest man among them, a freedman named Solomon Pinckney, born on a neighboring plantation in 1847, set down his crowbar and said, very quietly, that he had waited 60 years to learn what was on the other side of that wall. What they discovered inside that cabin would pull a county coroner out of retirement, produce a series of newspaper articles, yanked from print within 3 weeks, and expose a crime the Ravenel family had spent 2 generations and a small fortune trying to bury behind pine boards and Sunday piety. Before we continue with the story of Ravenel Bluff and the cabin sealed since 1863, make sure you're subscribed to this channel and leave a comment telling us which state you're listening from right now. Hearing from you across the country reminds me why these stories must never be forgotten. And now, to understand what lay behind that wall, we have to go back to the spring of 1849, when Ravenel Bluff was still seen as one of the most prosperous rice plantations along the tidal stretch of the Combahee River. The plantation sat on a high bank of sandy loam overlooking nearly 300 acres of flooded rice fields, bordered on the east by a dense stand of cypress and live oak draped in Spanish moss, and on the west by a low tidal creek that filled and drained with the salt, pulled rhythm of the Atlantic. That spring, the low country air was thick with the smell of mud and blooming jessamine. At night, the rice fields filled with the croaking of bullfrogs and the slow, steady clicking of rice birds coming down from the Carolina Piedmont to feed on the spring plantings. To the north, the Combahee River moved between banks of blackwater and tangled palmetto, its surface broken every few yards by the log, still shapes of alligators sunning themselves in the long afternoon light. In the geography of the antebellum South, this was one of the richest stretches of land in the Republic. A single acre of Combahee rice, at the price it commanded in the Charleston markets of 1849, was worth more than most free white farmers in the upcountry earned in a year. The main house was a 2-story Greek Revival structure, painted a particular shade of white that only the very wealthy could afford to maintain in that humid climate. Its columns were carved from heart pine, and its long verandas were shaded by the same live oaks that had already been old when the first European settlers passed through the region in the 1690s. The interior was furnished with pieces Augustine Ravenel's grandfather had shipped in from Philadelphia and New Orleans. Mahogany writing desks, a broadwood pianoforte in the front parlor, a French walnut sideboard carried down from Richmond on a coastal schooner in 1811. The floors were heart pine, the walls plastered and painted the color of old cream. Above the dining room fireplace hung an oil portrait of Augustine's father, Colonel Pierre Ravenel, who had served under General Andrew Jackson at the Battle of New Orleans. He stared down at every family meal with a severity that Augustine Ravenel, as a boy, had found difficult to bear. Behind the main house, arranged in a neat double row along a packed earth lane, stood the plantation's 12 slave cabins. These were small structures of rough, cut cypress plank roofed with hand-split shingles, each housing between 4 and 8 human beings who, under the laws of South Carolina in that year, were considered the personal property of Mr. Augustine Ravenel. The cabins had packed earth floors, a single hearth at one end, and small unglazed windows covered at night with oiled cloth. In the summer, they were thick with the smell of sweat, smoke, and the resinous breath of the pine forest beyond the fence. In the winter, they were cold enough that children slept 3 to a pallet for warmth. Between the cabins and the main house ran an invisible line that every person on the plantation understood without ever needing it explained. One side was the world of the Ravenel family. Ledger books, Sunday dinners, letters written on cream, laid paper. The other side was the world of work and survival, and the long memory of a people brought to that place from a continent most of them had never seen and would never see again. Augustine Ravenel was 46 years old in the spring of 1849. He was the third of his family to hold the plantation, descended from a Huguenot merchant who had fled France in the 1680s, settled in Charleston, and then pushed inland to the rice country. Augustine was a tall, narrow-shouldered man with sand, colored hair going gray at the temples, and a habit, noted by every neighbor who ever had supper at his table, of chewing the inside of his cheek when displeased. His wife, Henrietta Bonneau Ravenel, was 7 years his junior, educated in the French manner at a Charleston finishing school, and known among low-country gentry wives for her fierce adherence to class proprieties. They had 3 children, a daughter, Clotilda, who was 12 that spring, a son, Augustine Jr., who was 9, and a younger boy, Lawrence, who was 4. By the census of that year, the plantation held 47 enslaved people. Among them was a man named Ezekiel, head driver of the field hands, born on the plantation in 1809. His father before him had been brought in chains from Africa's windward coast in 1787. Ezekiel knew every inch of the rice fields, every working of the trunk gates that controlled the tidal flow, every name of every person in the cabins. In the unspoken hierarchy of the enslaved community, he was the man others turned to when a child fell ill or when a dispute needed settling without the overseer's involvement. He was 40 years old in the spring of 1849, a broad-shouldered man with hands so calloused he had lost most feeling in his fingertips, and he moved through the world with the careful patience of someone who had learned very young never to waste emotion or a word. There was a woman named Clarissa who ran the kitchen and was considered indispensable by Henrietta Ravenel. Clarissa was 52 that spring. She had been a girl of 8 when bought by Colonel Pierre Ravenel at the Charleston market in 1805, separated that same afternoon from her mother, whose name she could no longer remember by middle age. Over the decades, Clarissa had made herself the most skilled cook in the parish. Her shrimp pilau was famous from Beaufort to Charleston. She baked Ben wafers that Henrietta served to visiting state senators' wives. She knew every herb in the kitchen garden, every remedy for a child's fever, every measure of every ingredient in every recipe she had ever learned. And she also knew how to listen. The kitchen was where the main house and the quarters met, and Clarissa had spent 44 years standing at that intersection, hearing everything that passed between the two worlds and remembering it. And there was a young woman named Delia, 18 years old that spring, whose mother had died of fever the year before. Delia had been assigned to the main house as nursery maid to the youngest Ravenel child. She was tall for her time, with high cheekbones and dark eyes that seemed older than her years, and a careful stillness about her that her fellow servants had learned to respect. She did not speak unless addressed. She did not laugh where it could be heard, but she sang very softly to little Lawrence when she put him to sleep at night, old songs in a gullah patois her grandmother had brought from the Sea Islands. The child would fall asleep with his hand curled around one of her fingers, as if he had always known her. Delia's grandmother, whose name had been Bina, had told her as a child that the songs were older than any of them. Older than the plantations, older than the ships, and that as long as a child in the world could still hear them, they would not die. Delia had believed her. Singing those songs over the cradle of a white child, not her own, was, in some private corner of her mind, the only way she had of keeping her grandmother alive. The Ravenel family did not think about Delia. They did not think about any of the people who served them. The plantation's machinery was simply there. The way the tide was there, the way the heat was there, the way God was said to be there. Henrietta Ravenel recognized her house slaves by face and function, but could not have named a single field hand. Augustine kept better records, but only because records were money. In his study, in a leather-bound ledger stamped with the family crest, he wrote down every purchase, every birth, and every death among the people he owned, in the same neat column as livestock purchases and seed prices. In the architecture of his mind, there was no difference between the two. And on a plantation of 47 souls, one young woman in a cotton head wrap who sang to the baby was less visible than the furniture she dusted every morning. The Low Country's politics in 1849 were already beginning to tighten around this world's edges. In the Charleston newspapers delivered to Ravenel Bluff every Wednesday by courier, Augustine read with increasing frequency about Northern abolitionist agitation, debates over slavery in the new Western territories, the fury of Senator Calhoun, and the nervous calculations of the great cotton planters. The nullification crisis of the 1830s was still a recent memory. The Mexican War had just ended. The Compromise of 1850 was a year away. Augustine Ravenel, like most of his class, believed with a conviction that admitted no argument that the Southern way of life was divinely sanctioned and economically necessary. He was prepared, if necessary, to defend it. He did not yet know that within 12 years his country would split in two over the precise question of whether he should be permitted to continue owning the woman who dusted his desk. And Delia, who knew nothing of the debates in Washington, continued to sing to his youngest son in the nursery, to make the little boy laugh and to keep him alive through the fevers of his first years. Because that was what she had been assigned to do, and because the boy, in his own way, had become what made her own life bearable. This was the ordinary world of Ravenel Bluff in the spring of 1849, a world of rice and rhetoric, mint juleps on the veranda and Sunday sermons at the Beaufort District Parish Church, neat ledger books in Augustine's study, recording every bushel, every birth, and every purchase, of livestock and of people alike. It was a world its inhabitants believed would last forever. It was a world about to crack open along a seam no one in the main house had yet seen. The crack began in the summer of 1852, when Augustine Ravenel's youngest son, Lawrence, died of yellow fever. He was 7 years old. The fever came that summer to Beaufort District in one of the worst outbreaks the region had seen since the epidemic of 1817. It moved through the low-lying plantations along the Combahee River the way fever had always moved in that country. Through the mosquito, thick air of August dusk, striking the youngest and oldest first. At Ravenel Bluff, it took 3 people in 2 weeks. An elderly field hand named Old Moses died on August 11th. A 4-year-old girl in the second cabin died on the 15th, and on the morning of the 21st, little Lawrence Ravenel woke with a flushed face and a temperature that made Delia's hand jerk back when she touched his forehead. The boy lasted 8 days. For the first 3, he alternated between fever and shivering. asking for his mother, who could not be reached in time, and for Delia, who did not leave his side. By the 5th day, the disease had entered its second phase, yellowing of his eyes, retching of black matter that gave yellow fever its old name, vomito negro. Delia, now 21, held him through each convulsion with a steadiness the household physician, Dr. Franklin Lezezin, later described in a letter to Henrietta Ravenel as remarkable. When Lawrence could no longer speak, Delia held his hand and sang the same song she had sung when he was an infant. About the river that ran to the sea, about the woman who became a bird. She sang until her voice gave out, then hummed, then simply held him. Henrietta Ravenel was in Charleston visiting her sister when the child died. Augustine was in the study. It was Delia who closed the boy's eyes, washed his small body with rosewater, wrapped him in linen set aside for the purpose, and did not cry in front of the physician, because she knew no one in the main house would ask her to. In the weeks that followed, something shifted in the main house. Henrietta returned from Charleston 3 days after her son's burial, collapsed in the front hall, and had to be carried upstairs. She did not leave her bedroom for nearly 4 months. The nursery curtains were drawn. The toys were wrapped in muslin and packed away. The house was draped in black crepe, mirrors turned to the wall, and mantel clocks stopped at the hour of the boy's death. Augustine, who had been distant from his children most of their lives, began spending long hours in the nursery, where his youngest son had died, sitting in the rocking chair Delia had once used. He drank more than ever, slept badly, snapped at his daughter Clotilda, who was 15 that summer and had begun fearing her father in a way she never had. And Delia, with nowhere else to go, was often in that same nursery, folding small clothes that would never be worn again, dusting a rocking horse that would never be ridden. What happened between them in that nursery over the next year did not happen because either of them chose it in any sense a free person would recognize as choice. Augustine Ravenel was the man who owned her. Under South Carolina law in 1852, there was no such thing as the rape of an enslaved woman by her enslaver, because the word rape required violation of the victim's will, and the law did not recognize that an enslaved woman possessed a will that could be violated. This was not a private opinion of the Ravenel family. It was the written law of the state, upheld by every court south of the Mason-Dixon line, most infamously articulated by Judge Thomas Ruffin of North Carolina in the 1829 case State v. Mann, when the judge wrote that the master's power must be absolute to render the slave's submission perfect. Under the cover of that law, under the cover of his wife's grief, under the cover of the quiet, mourning, draped rooms, Augustine Ravenel began a relationship with the young woman who had held his dying son. Delia did not fight him. A woman in her position who fought would be whipped, sold, or worse. She did what she had always done, went still, went silent, sang one of her grandmother's old songs in her own mind, and waited for it to be over. When she walked back to her cabin, afterward in the darkness of the lane between the quarters, she walked without making any sound at all. She had learned by age 22 that the body could be separated from the self if you were very careful, if you kept singing. In the autumn of 1853, Delia was pregnant. She was 22 years old. She told no one. The other women in the cabin saw her body changing under her apron and knew, as women have always known. Clarissa, who ran the kitchen, took her aside one evening behind the smokehouse and asked whose it was. Delia did not answer. She didn't have to. Clarissa had lived on Ravenel Bluff for 31 years. She had seen this before. What happened to the women it happened to, and what happened to the children? Clarissa, who had buried 3 of her own children, and watched a fourth sold away to an Alabama plantation when the girl was 12. Looked at Delia for a long time in the red light of the setting sun. Then she took the younger woman's hand in her own and said that whatever happened, she would help her. She said it quietly, once, then went back to the kitchen and did not speak of it again. The child was born in the spring of 1854, in the slave quarters, in the smallest cabin at the end of the row, the one given to Delia after her mother's death. The midwife was an elderly woman named Grace, who had delivered more than 100 babies on that plantation and the surrounding ones in her long life. The labor was long. Delia made almost no sound. When the child came at last, just before dawn on an early April morning, he came quietly, eyes open, looking at the lantern as if he had been expecting it. It was a boy. Delia named him Isaac, after her grandfather, who had been brought to the Sea Islands on a ship whose name no one in his family had ever known. The child was light-skinned, with hair the color of wet sand and eyes that would, as he grew, turn the same pale gray as Augustine Ravenel's. When Grace saw the child, she looked at Delia and didn't need to ask. She washed the baby in a basin of warm water, wrapped him in clean linen, placed him in his mother's arms, then sat down on the wooden stool beside the bed and said, very softly, that the child had the look of someone whose life would need to be guarded carefully. Delia nodded. She already knew. Henrietta Ravenel knew, too. She could not know. The child was too obvious, the plantation too small, the other servants' eyes too knowing for her to pretend otherwise. For several weeks after Isaac's birth, Henrietta did not come down to breakfast. When she finally did, on a morning in late April, she did not speak to her husband across the table, not meaningfully, for nearly a year. But Henrietta was a woman of her class and time. The solution to such a problem, among low-country planter families, was not to acknowledge it. Divorce was impossible. Scandal was unthinkable. The solution was to keep the mother in the cabin at the far end of the row. Pretend the child belonged to some unnamed field hand, and wait for the years to soften the resemblance's outline into something that could be politely ignored. For 8 years, that is what they did. Delia raised Isaac in the cabin at the row's end. Augustine continued, intermittently and in a pattern only Delia and Clarissa would have recognized, to visit her. Henrietta lived in the main house, conducted her social calls, took the sacrament at the parish church, and did not speak her husband's name in connection with the child in the cabin. Isaac grew. He learned to walk, to talk, and from the other children in the quarters, the careful art of becoming invisible whenever a white person passed. By the time he was 7, he was the quietest child on the plantation. But he was also, in the private geography of his mother's cabin, a child who laughed. Delia had carved out a small world for him, with Clarissa's help and the help of the other women of the quarters. That was entirely his own. She had taught him to read in secret from a torn Bible Clarissa had smuggled out of the main house, and soon into the lining of Delia's mattress. She had taught him to count using dried beans in a kitchen jar. She had taught him the old songs, and she had taught him, in the careful language an enslaved mother used to teach her son to survive, when to speak and when to be silent, when to bow his head and when to meet a white man's eyes, when to laugh and when to hold his face as still as a pond at dawn. By his 8th year, he had learned all these lessons. He was quick and watchful. Delia sometimes watched him sleeping at night in the yellow light of a single tallow candle and thought, with a kind of grief she had no word for, that he was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen, and that the world into which he had been born was going to destroy him, and she could not imagine a future where this would not be true. Ezekiel, the head driver, was one of the few people on the plantation who spoke to the boy directly. In the long evenings of spring and summer, when the day's work was done, Ezekiel would sometimes come to the end of the lane where Delia's cabin stood, sit on the wooden step outside the door, and tell Isaac stories. He told him about the river, the birds, the way the tide worked. He told him, in a careful, coded way, about places up north where a man could be free. He didn't say the word freedom. He didn't have to. Isaac, small and thin, watching the older man with gray eyes already old for his age, understood what was being described. Delia, listening from inside, said nothing. She was afraid of what Ezekiel was telling her son, and afraid of what would happen if he did not tell him. Then, in the summer of 1862, everything changed. The war had come to the Sea Islands. The Union Navy had taken Port Royal the previous November, landing troops on Hilton Head and surrounding islands, sending the region's white population fleeing inland. Confederate planters up and down the coast were beginning to understand their world was ending. The great Sea Island plantations had been abandoned. The enslaved people left behind had been declared contraband of war by General Benjamin Butler, and then, in January 1863, declared free by the Emancipation Proclamation. News of all this reached the Combahee River plantations. Through channels the planters could not control, the kitchens, then the stables, then the cabins within days. Augustine Ravenel, now 59 and 30 pounds lighter than the year before, began drinking in the evenings in a way his wife and daughter pretended not to notice. He sat up late in his study with ledgers open, staring at columns representing a form of wealth he now understood was about to be taken from him. He wrote long letters to his Charleston banker and his Richmond brother-in-law. He slept, when he slept at all, in the chair by the study fire, with a pistol on the desk beside him. The field hands were beginning to disappear, slipping away at night toward Union lines, and no amount of patrolling could stop them. In April 1862, 3 young men from the second cabin left together and were never heard from again. In June, a woman named Hannah and her 2 daughters simply weren't in their cabin when the bell rang at dawn. Ezekiel, the head driver, who had been with the family since before Augustine inherited the plantation, walked into the woods on the night of August 9, 1862, and never came back. In the preceding weeks, he had begun speaking more openly to the quarter's younger men about what was coming. Then, one warm night, he simply stepped out of his cabin and was gone. He was 53 years old. He left behind a wife named Chloe, who would eventually find him again in the fall of 1864 at a contraband camp outside Beaufort, and who would die in his arms of pneumonia in the winter of 1867. A free woman on free land. Augustine Ravenel began to be afraid. It was a specific, nameable fear. He was afraid of what would happen when the Union Army came, and he knew now it would come. He was afraid of his ledgers being read by Yankee officers. He was afraid of his neighbors, several of whom had already begun whispering about him in Beaufort society. About the child at the quarter's end, about the resemblance no longer deniable as the boy grew older. And in a way he had not previously permitted himself to think, he was afraid of Delia and of 8-year-old Isaac, whose face was a daily public record of something Henrietta had spent 9 years pretending did not exist. The war was about to make Delia a free woman. A free Delia could testify. A free Delia could write her own name, if she chose, on a piece of paper any Union officer in the region would read with interest. A free Delia, holding the hand of a light-skinned boy whose features mirrored one of the most prominent planters on the Combahee, was no longer a private shame to be managed behind a plank wall. She was a witness, and witnesses, in the calculation of a man like Augustine Ravenel, were not problems to be reasoned with. They were problems to be solved. In the autumn of 1862, Augustine Ravenel began making arrangements. He told his wife one evening in October that Delia had grown insolent and it was time to sell her away. Henrietta, who had waited 9 years for this conversation, did not argue. She asked only that it be done quickly and that the child go with her. Augustine agreed. He did not, however, contact any slave trader. The ports were blockaded. Charleston's auction houses were empty. Augustine had begun, in the long evenings of that autumn, calculating a different sort of arithmetic. What happened next is the heart of what the men found behind the wall in 1908. The part of this story the Ravenel family spent 45 years and 2 generations trying to hide. I want to pause here to ask you, if this story is pulling you in, hit that like button and leave a comment with your thoughts so far. The algorithm only shows these stories to more people when you engage. There are descendants of families like Delia's across this country who deserve to have their histories heard. Keep watching, because what I am about to tell you is the piece Augustine Ravenel paid to keep buried. On the night of January 17, 1863, according to the testimony Solomon Pinckney would give to the Beaufort County coroner on October 29, 1908. Augustine Ravenel came to the cabin at the end of the row with a bottle of imported French brandy, a folded document bearing a Charleston notary's seal, and 2 men from a neighboring plantation Solomon did not recognize. Solomon was 15 at the time. He was in the neighboring cabin, separated from Delia's by a single plank wall, and he heard everything. His grandmother, a woman named Flora who had raised him after his mother's death, was asleep on the other side of the small room, worn down by a cough that would kill her before winter's end. Solomon was wide awake, as he had been on most nights that January. He was a boy who listened. Augustine told Delia he had purchased her freedom. He showed her the notarized document. He told her he had arranged for her and Isaac to be taken by wagon that night to a safe house in Walterboro, and from there to Charleston, where they would board a ship bound for Liverpool. He said the war would be over soon, and she could not be here when it ended. He said he had provided a sum of money sufficient to begin a new life. He asked her to pack what she needed and wake the boy. Through the wall, Solomon heard Augustine's voice clearly, the voice of a man trying to sound generous, but also like a man who had made a decision he did not intend to unmake. Solomon had heard that voice many times in his short life, the voice white men used when they had already decided a conversation's outcome. And it did not matter what the other person said. Delia did as she was told. Solomon heard her moving quietly in the dark, telling the child in that low singing voice that they were going on a journey, that he should be brave and very quiet. He heard her wrap a small bundle of clothes, strike a match to light a candle stub, to find the child's shoes. He heard the child ask if they were going to see the ocean. He heard her say yes. Solomon, in the dark of his own cabin, began to pray. He didn't know precisely why. He couldn't have articulated what was wrong, but something in the arrangement of voices on the other side of the wall had set a cold weight in his chest that would not lift. Then Solomon heard the 2 men from the neighboring plantation come into the cabin. What happened in that cabin over the next half hour is the thing the wall was built to hide. Through the plank wall, Solomon heard it all. He heard the child cry out once. A small, high sound of surprise more than fear, because the child had not yet understood what was about to happen. He heard Delia scream, a single scream cut short. He heard a sound he would not be able to describe to the coroner 45 years later, without stopping to ask for water. A heavy sound, a wet sound, then a second, smaller version of the same sound. Then, for a very long time, silence. Solomon did not move. His grandmother slept through all of it. Because she was old, her cough had exhausted her. And because the human body will sometimes refuse, at the end of a long life, to wake for sounds a waking mind could not survive. Solomon lay in the dark with the cold weight in his chest, did not cry, did not move, and listened to the silence on the other side of the wall as if he could, by listening hard enough, will it to become something else. It did not. Before dawn, Augustine Ravenel and the two men left the cabin. They went to the carriage house and returned with tools. For the rest of that night, and into the gray of the next morning, Solomon listened through the wall to the sound of hammers, of boards being nailed across the inside of the door, of tar brushed over the seams, and of a wooden bar driven across the outside of the cabin and sealed with nails as long as a man's hand. When Solomon dared, near noon, to look through a knothole in his own cabin wall, he saw three men whitewashing the exterior of the sealed cabin with a slurry of lime and pine tar. Their faces were set in a way that told him, even at 15, that they were not men who would admit to what they had done in daylight. Augustine Ravenel told the remaining enslaved people that Delia and her boy had been sold in the night to a trader bound for Cuba. He said the cabin had been sealed because of fever. He said no one was to go near it, that anyone caught near that cabin would be whipped within an inch of their life. Then, because the war was coming and there was no time for sentiment, he moved on. 6 months later, in July 1863, Augustine Ravenel was dead. He had been thrown from a horse on the river road, his neck broken against a fence post. He died where he fell, with no last confession, no last arrangement, no last alteration to the will he had signed in 1861. His widow, Henrietta, inherited the plantation. The Union Army reached the Combahee River in the late summer of that year during the raid led by Harriet Tubman and Colonel James Montgomery, and 32 of the remaining 39 enslaved people at Ravenel Bluff walked away toward the gunboats and were free. Solomon Pinckney was among them. He was 15 years old. For the next 45 years, the sealed cabin at the Rose End stood where Augustine Ravenel had left it. Henrietta Ravenel, who lived until the winter of 1907, never spoke of it. Her surviving children, Clotilda and Augustine Ginger, grew up knowing only that their father had ordered the cabin sealed because of fever and that it was not to be touched. When Clotilda married a Charleston physician in 1868 and moved away, she did not look back at it. When Augustine Ginger inherited the plantation in his mother's last years, he did not look at it either. The cabin was whitewashed a second time in 1881 during a general repainting of the outbuildings, and a third time in 1899 when the plantation was first put up for sale. Each time, the workmen were told by the estate's overseer, an old man named Claiborne Huger, who had served the Ravenels since before the war, that the cabin was to be painted over, but never opened. Claiborne Huger died in 1906. He took what he knew with him. Decades passed. The fields grew up in pine saplings and broom sedge. The main house, grand in 1849, settled and sagged on its foundations. By 1908, the plantation had been sold twice and was in the hands of a Savannah timber company that had no use for it except to harvest the last live oak and pine and subdivide the rest for small farms. The timber company hired a local foreman named Edgar Fripp to tear down the outbuildings. Edgar Fripp hired a crew of 5 men on the morning of October 27, 1908. That crew came down the old packed earth lane between the rows of collapsed cabins and arrived at the one at the end of the row. The one whitewashed 3 times. Standing slightly apart, the one no one in Beaufort County could remember ever having seen opened. Edgar Fripp, a practical man not given to superstition, told his crew to knock it down. He didn't know about the wall built on the inside. He thought it was just another slave cabin. Dozens stood abandoned up and down the coast, and that it would come down in 20 minutes. Just when we thought we understood the story of Ravenel Bluff, the horror sealed inside that cabin is about to come out into the daylight for the first time in 45 years. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark American history. Hit that like button to support the channel and subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. What Edgar Fripp's crew was about to find will change everything. The first crowbar blow against the outer wall came down just after 1100 a.m. The plank splintered easily. The wood was old, cypress cut from the river bottom 60 years before, and gave way with the dry crack of something that had been waiting a long time to fall. The second blow took down a second board. The third exposed what at first seemed to be a second wall, perhaps 18 inches behind the first. Nailed up from the inside with the same cypress plank, seams sealed with black tar hardened to the consistency of stone. The men paused. They had all seen the outside whitewashed 3 times, but none had expected a second wall. Edgar Fripp stepped forward, ran his hand along the inner wall, pulled back his fingers and smelled them, then looked at Solomon Pinckney, the oldest man on the crew and the only one among them alive in 1863. The younger workers, who had started the morning joking about how quickly the job would go, had fallen completely silent. One of them, a man named Jessup, took off his hat and began turning it slowly in his hands. Another, the youngest, a boy of 19 named Caleb, took several steps back from the cabin, without seeming aware he was doing it. The autumn light fell slant through the pines. Somewhere in the distance, a mourning dove called 3 times and stopped. Solomon, who had waited 45 years for this moment, said nothing. He took the crowbar from the younger man nearest him, walked up to the inner wall, set the bar against the seam between 2 boards, and pulled. His hands, grown old on their own schedule, were shaking. He had to set the bar a second time before he could get leverage. When the board finally came loose, it came away with a long tearing sound, like cloth being torn in half. The smell that came out was not the smell of fever. It was not any illness Edgar Fripp had encountered in his 41 years. It was the dry, dusty, faintly sweet smell of something sealed in darkness for nearly half a century. And it carried the particular, unmistakable weight of the human dead. It was, Edgar Fripp would later say in an interview that was never published, a smell a man could recognize, even if he had never smelled it before, because some part of the human mind knew it, the way the body knew hunger or thirst. Solomon Pinckney, who had smelled it before in the war's hospitals, took 2 steps back from the opening and sat down on a fallen log. His face had gone gray. Edgar Fripp ordered the crew to stop. He sent the youngest worker, Caleb, running 2 miles through the pine woods to the nearest telephone at the Green Pond General Store, with instructions to call the Beaufort County Sheriff and the county coroner. Then Edgar Fripp, Solomon Pinckney, and the 3 remaining men sat down on the ground 20 feet from the cabin and waited. No one spoke. Solomon Pinckney, according to an account later given to a Charleston News and Courier reporter, took off his hat, held it in both hands, and did not put it back on for the rest of the afternoon. Jessup, a Methodist, prayed quietly under his breath. Edgar Fripp, not a religious man, smoked 3 cigarettes in succession and stared at the cabin's broken wall as if trying to memorize it. A squirrel ran down the nearest pine trunk, saw the men, and scrambled back up without a sound. The sheriff, Osgood Hayward, arrived at Ravenel Bluff just after 2:00 p.m., accompanied by the county coroner, Dr. Rutherford Stewart, a physician who had officially retired from the coroner's office 2 years before, but still served on the most serious cases, because no one else in the county had his experience. Dr. Stewart was 68 feet, a thin, white-haired man with a clipped manner of speaking and pale eyes that didn't miss much. He had been a Confederate Army surgeon at Fredericksburg, Chickamauga, and through the long, terrible winter of the siege of Petersburg, he had seen more death than most men could imagine. He approached the broken wall with a handkerchief pressed to his nose and mouth, went inside with a kerosene lantern, and came out 11 minutes later with an expression the sheriff would describe in his written report as the look of a man who had just been shown something he had hoped never to see. He walked a short distance from the cabin, leaned against a live oak trunk, and stood there for a full 2 minutes without speaking. When he turned back, his voice was steady, but his hands were not. What Dr. Stewart found inside that cabin, and what he would document in the county coroner's report of October 30th, 1908, was this. The cabin was a single room, approximately 12 by 14 feet, with a packed earth floor, a small hearth at one end, and a narrow loft accessed by a wooden ladder. The interior had been stripped of all furniture, except a single iron bed frame against the far wall. On the bed frame, arranged with a care that struck Dr. Stewart as the most disturbing element of the entire scene, were the remains of two human beings. One was an adult female determined by pelvic dimensions and skull development to have been approximately 18 to 25 years old at death. The other was a child, male, between 7 and 9 years old. The remains had been almost entirely mummified by the sealed, dry conditions of the cabin, which had kept out moisture and scavengers for 45 years. The skin had become the color and texture of old parchment. The hair was still attached to the scalps. The clothing, a simple cotton dress on the woman, a linen shirt and wool trousers on the boy, was intact, though faded and brittle. The woman's arms were positioned around the child, whose head rested against her shoulder. They had been placed that way after death. Dr. Stewart was certain of this because the arrangement was too composed to have occurred during any struggle. Someone, he noted in his report, had taken the time to lay them together in something approximating a posture of rest, and then built a wall around them, and then gone home. On the woman's skull, at the left temple, was a clearly visible fracture consistent with a single heavy blow from a blunt object. On the back of the child's skull was a similar fracture. The bones of both bodies were otherwise intact. No evidence of struggle, no defensive wounds to the forearms, no displaced limbs. Whatever had been done to them had been done quickly. This was, Dr. Stewart wrote, a mercy of a kind, though the word mercy was not one he used without discomfort in this context. On a small wooden table beside the bed was a folded piece of paper, brittle with age but still legible. It was a notarized bill of manumission dated January 15, 1863, signed by Augustine Ravenel, granting freedom to one Delia, 22 years of age, and her son Isaac, 8 years of age. The document bore the seal of a Charleston notary, a man named Francis Gadsden, who had died in 1879, but whose records had been preserved in the Charleston County Archives. And his signature matched the signature on the document exactly. Beside the paper was a small leather pouch containing 37 silver coins, mostly Mexican and Spanish pieces of 8 dated between 1821 and 1859, a year's wages for a free laborer in 1863, enough to begin a life if you were willing to work and careful. Beside the pouch was a single object wrapped in muslin cloth. When Dr. Stewart unwrapped it, he found a child's wooden horse carved by hand from what looked like live oak, smoothed by years of a small palm closing around it. The mane had been carved in fine detail. The tail had been notched with the care of a man who loved making small things. Stuck to the underside, scratched into the wood with something sharp, were two initials, IR, Isaac Ravenel. Dr. Stewart came out of the cabin, sat down on the earth beside Solomon Pinckney, and did not speak for a long time. The two old men, the white doctor and the black freedman, sat side by side on the ground in the October sunlight without looking at each other. The sheriff and the remaining workmen stood a respectful distance away and did not interrupt them. At last, Solomon looked at him and asked, in the careful voice he had used to speak to white men all his life, whether the bodies were of a woman and a boy. Dr. Stewart said yes. Solomon asked whether the boy had light hair. Dr. Stewart said he could not be certain due to the remains condition, but that what hair was present appeared fair. Solomon nodded once, then began to cry. He was 76 years old. He had not cried, according to his grandchildren later interviewed, in any of their lifetimes. He cried without sound for nearly 20 minutes. Then he stood up, put his hat back on, and told Sheriff Hayward and Dr. Stewart what he had heard on the night of January 17, 1863. He told it slowly, in the same careful voice, stopping twice to ask for water. He named the men. He described the sounds. He described, with an accuracy later corroborated by the coroner's findings, exactly where the bodies had been placed on the bed, which one had been killed first, and how he knew. When he was finished, Sheriff Hayward took off his own hat, and the three men stood together in the long October shadows and did not speak for a long time. The investigation that followed lasted exactly 17 days, and then it was over. Sheriff Osgood Hayward took Solomon Pinckney's statement on the evening of October 29, 1908, and filed it with the county court. Dr. Stewart filed his coroner's report on the 30th. Both documents clearly named Augustine Ravenel, deceased in 1863, as the probable perpetrator, and named two further unidentified individuals as his accomplices. The local paper, the Beaufort Gazette, ran a story on the morning of October 31st under the headline, "Grim Discovery at Old Ravenel Place," describing the remains discovery and alluding, in the careful language of 1908 South Carolina, to the possibility of a crime. The Charleston News and Courier picked up the story on November 2nd. A reporter from the Savannah Morning News came to Beaufort County on November 4th and interviewed Solomon Pinckney at length. Then, on November 17, 1908, the story disappeared. The Beaufort Gazette ran no further articles. The Charleston News and Courier printed a brief notice on its back page stating that the remains had been interred at the county's expense in an unmarked grave at a nearby cemetery, and that no further investigation was warranted given the principal suspect's death 45 years prior. The Savannah Morning News never ran the interview its reporter had conducted. When Solomon Pinckney's grandson, Samuel Pinckney, attempted in 1934 to obtain a copy of Sheriff Hayward's original report from the Beaufort County Courthouse, he was told the file could not be located. What happened, it is now possible to piece together from later evidence, was this: Clotilda Ravenel, Augustine and Henrietta's daughter, was by 1908 a Charleston widow and the mother of 3 sons, 2 of whom were prominent in South Carolina politics. Her brother Augustine Jr. had died in 1901, but his sons, her nephews, were officers in the state banking system. The Ravenel family had, in the 45 years since the war, rebuilt its fortune through timber interests, banking, and marriage. It was not a family that could afford a newspaper story circulating about a murder committed by its patriarch. Through mechanisms never documented but not difficult to imagine, the story was made to go away. Sheriff Hayward, who ran for re-election in 1910, did not mention the case in his campaign. Dr. Stewart, who died in 1912, never spoke of it publicly. The Savannah Morning News reporter was reassigned to the agricultural desk and left the paper within the year. What the Ravenel family could not control was Solomon Pinckney. Solomon lived until 1927, 79 years old when he died. In the last decades of his life, he told the story of what he had heard through the wall on the night of January 17, 1863, to anyone who would listen. He told it to his children and grandchildren. He told it to his African Methodist Episcopal congregation in Green Pond. He told it, on one occasion in 1921, to a young Fisk University graduate student traveling through the Low Country, collecting oral histories of formerly enslaved people, whose notebooks were eventually deposited in a university archive and not cataloged until the 1970s. Solomon insisted, every time he told it, on 3 points. First, that Delia had been told she was being freed, and had believed it until the other 2 men entered the cabin. Second, that the child Isaac had died knowing he was being taken to see the ocean. Third, that Augustine Ravenel had sealed the cabin not out of shame, but out of calculation. He sealed it because a living woman and a living child, both free, and both carrying evidence of his paternity, could destroy him and his family in a way the corpses behind a plank wall never could. Augustine Ravenel murdered them, not to hide evidence of his crimes against Delia. He murdered them because the imminent arrival of the Union Army was about to make her testimony and her son's face into weapons that could be used against him in a court of law and in the court of public opinion. A free Delia walking into a Union camp in the summer of 1863 with a light-skinned boy by her hand and a manumission paper in her pocket would have been one of the most devastating witnesses in the Low Country's history. Augustine Ravenel did the arithmetic of his class and time and decided it was easier to seal 2 human beings into a wooden box than to face the consequences of having treated them as human beings in the first place. The manumission paper, it turned out, had been real. He had paid to have it drawn up. He had gone through the legal motions of freeing them. And then, on the night he promised them freedom, he killed them. The paper in the cabin was not evidence of a generous impulse gone wrong. It was evidence of a trap set with care. Delia had believed she was free because Augustine showed her the paper and let her read it. Then, once she believed it, once she woke her son and told him they were going to see the ocean, he let in the men who would make sure no such journey would ever be taken. The woman and child in the cabin were buried as the Charleston News and Courier had reported, in an unmarked grave in the county cemetery. In 1998, the Pinckney family, working with a historical preservation society and a team of forensic archaeologists from the University of South Carolina, located the grave. In 2003, after 5 years of legal wrangling with the county, the remains were disinterred, re-identified through careful comparison with the surviving 1908 coroner's photographs, and reburied with headstones. The headstones are plain gray granite, each carved with a single name, and, for the first time in either of their lives, a date of death: Delia, 1840 UR 17th, 1863 ISS 1854 JNR 17th, 1863. Alongside them is a third stone added by the Pinckney family in 2004, reading in simple lettering TEY VRTLD TCHI WAR EFREE ALOED. Solomon Pinckney heard it through the wall and remembered. The Ravenel Bluff property was developed in the 1950s into a planned subdivision of vacation homes. The main house had burned in a lightning storm in 1931 and was never rebuilt. The slave quarters, including the cabin at the Rose End, had been torn down after the 1908 investigation, their timbers hauled away and burned in a brush pile at the edge of what had been the rice field. There is a historical marker now, placed in 2009 at the turnoff from the old River Road. It notes the plantation's existence, the names of the people enslaved there, and the 1908 discovery. It does not name the Ravenel family, but the descendants of Augustine Ravenel still live in Charleston. The bank he helped found still operates under a different name on Broad Street. His great-grandchildren sit on charitable foundation boards. They give to historical preservation societies. They have, in the last several years, been asked to contribute to the maintenance of the cemetery where Delia and Isaac now lie. And they have, to their credit, quietly done so. The money comes through a trust with no family name attached. It was Clotilda Ravenel's granddaughter, a historian in her 70s who spent her career studying the low-country rice economy, who arranged the trust in 2007. She never spoke publicly about the case, but in a letter to the Historical Preservation Society's director, released with her permission after her death in 2019, she wrote only this: "My great-grandfather built a wall. It was never going to be strong enough. The voices of the people he sealed behind it have been speaking for 150 years, and my family has been listening, whether we admitted it or not. It is past time we answered." There are plantations like Ravenel Bluff up and down the coast of South Carolina and Georgia. Places where the cabins have all been torn down, the fields grown up in pine, and where, behind polite historical markers, there are stories sealed in darkness by men who thought they could outlast the memory of what they had done. Some of those stories have come out. Most have not. The cabin at Ravenel Bluff is only one of them. And if the story of Delia and Isaac proves anything, it proves that walls do not hold forever, that the men who build them die, and that the voices they tried to silence have a way of reaching the next generation, and the generation after that. Through the patience of witnesses like Solomon Pinckney, who listened through a plank wall at 15 and carried what he heard for 60 years until the daylight came. What do you think of this story? Do you believe every wall eventually falls? Or do you think some crimes stay buried forever? Leave your comment below. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and share it with someone who understands that American history is not only what was written in the ledgers, but also what was whispered through the walls. See you in the next video.